On the third morning after the battle, a woman named Thea stood at the second floor window of a house on the hill above the Agora of Corinth and watched smoke rise from the Roman camp beyond the isthmus where 23,000 soldiers had settled into the routine of waiting. She was 34 years old, the wife of a man named Aristomos who had sat on the Corinthian council for 11 years and who had voted to reject every peace offer Rome had sent. He had marched out 3 days ago with the army. He had not come back. The streets below her were empty in a way she had never witnessed in her life. Corinth was a city that never stopped moving. Merchants from Egypt and Phoenicia crowded the docks at Lene before sunrise, shouting prices in languages that mixed and collided like waves against a breakwater. Traders hauled perfume and linen and bronze across the Diocos, the great stone-paved road connecting the two seas, the sound of their carts grinding against the limestone ruts carrying all the way up the hill. The Agora itself was so dense with bodies at midday that a woman could cross it only by pressing through shoulders and elbows, inhaling the smell of roasting meat and fresh dye and the sharp vinegar tang of wine sold by the cup. On this morning the only sound was the wind pushing through open doorways and the high thin whine of a dog somewhere down the slope calling for an owner who was not coming. She had not eaten since the day before. The household stores were gone, not taken by Romans, taken by Corinthians. Lutters had come on the first night, freed slaves and dock workers and men who had not marched with the army, breaking into homes along the upper streets while the city had no guards and no law. They had taken the grain, the oil, the emporers of wine from the storeroom. They had taken the silver drinking cups from the Andrin, the dining room where her husband had once hosted visiting diplomats from the lake. They had pulled the bronze mirrors off the walls of the bedchamber worth a month's wages each. They had not touched Thea or her 2 daughters, 12 and 9, who had hidden in the cellar behind a false wall Aristomos had built years earlier, when piracy along the coast had made every wealthy household cautious. The men were looking for things they could carry and sell, not people, not yet. On the second day, a neighbor named Daphne had come to the door with her 3 children and told Thea what she had heard from a potter's apprentice who had watched the battle from the slopes above the isthmus. The army was destroyed. The Achaean cavalry had broken first, outnumbered 6 to 1 by Roman horsemen who struck the flanks like a door swinging shut. Then the infantry collapsed. General Duz had not stayed to rally the survivors. He had not tried to hold the walls. He had mounted a horse and ridden south to his home city of Megalopoulos, where he poisoned his own wife to keep her out of Roman hands, and then swallowed poison himself. Thea listened to this. She absorbed the fact that the commander of the Achaean army, the man who had started this war, who had arrested peace advocates and rejected every negotiation, had not considered defending the women and children in the city he was supposed to protect. He had considered only his own wife, and the mercy he offered her was death. Now on the third morning she could smell burning cypress from the south, carried on the wind off the surround. It mixed with something else, something acrid and thick that coated the inside of her mouth from the storage room. Behind her, she could hear her younger daughter coughing, a dry, persistent sound that had started on the first night and had not stopped. She pressed her palm against the stone of the window frame and felt it cool beneath her skin, despite the August heat, and she thought about what she had been in this city 1 week ago, the wife of a councilman, a woman who wore gold at the Isthmian Games and sat in the reserved seats, a woman who climbed the path to the temple of Aphrodite on the Acorinth twice a year to leave offerings of perfumed oil and silver jewelry, praying for the safety of her household and the prosperity of the city, a woman whose name, when spoken in the agora, produced recognition. Through the window she could see the 7 great Doric columns of the temple of Apollo standing against a sky that should have been blue but was stained brownish-grey by smoke. Beyond them, rising 550 m above the plain like a fist of limestone punched up through the earth, the massive rock of the Acorinth, the temple of Aphrodite, sat at its summit 300 years earlier when the Persian king Xerxes had marched on Greece with an army that darkened the land. The women of Corinth had gathered at that temple and begged the goddess to save them. The poet Simonides had commemorated their prayers in an epic that was carved into a tablet and placed in the sanctuary. Aphrodite had listened. The Persians were defeated. Greece survived. Thea did not know if anyone was praying up there now. She did not know if it mattered. What she could see on the plain beyond the walls was movement, ordered formations of men, their equipment catching the morning light in rhythmic flashes as they assembled into columns. They were coming, but before I tell you what happened when the Roman consul Lucius Mummus finally walked through those gates on the 3rd day, I need to take you back to the city this woman once knew and show you what Rome was about to destroy. If this is your first time on the channel, you are about to hear the story of what happened to the women of Corinth in 146 years before the Common Era. You are going to learn how a city that controlled 2 seas and generated more wealth than any other, Greece, was reduced to ash and silence in a single week. How the wives and daughters of the most powerful men in the Greek world were stripped of their gold, catalogued by age and skill, and sold alongside household servants on platforms at the slave market of Delos. How priestesses who had served the most famous goddess in the ancient world were marched in chains to the docks of the city they had once prayed to protect. And how the same year Rome destroyed Carthage, it destroyed Corinth, and the historian Polybius, who watched both cities burn, walked through the ruins of his own people's civilization and saw Roman soldiers playing dice on priceless Greek paintings they had thrown on the ground. Subscribe if you want to hear the full story. This one does not end well for anyone. To understand what Rome took from the women of Corinth, you first have to understand what those women had. Corinth sat on the narrowest point of the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland of Greece, and this accident of geography made it one of the richest cities in the ancient world. It controlled 2 harbors, lean, opened west onto the Corinthian Gulf, giving access to Italy, Sicily, and the trade routes of the western Mediterranean. Senra opened east onto the surround Gulf, connecting Corinth to Athens, the Aegean Islands, the great markets of Egypt, and the luxury goods of Asia Minor. Every merchant who wanted to move cargo between east and west without risking the storm-lashed route. Around the southern tip of the Peloponnese had to come through Corinth. The Corinthians had even built the Diokos, a stone-paved road across the isthmus where entire ships could be dragged overland on wheeled cradles from one sea to the other. The city charged for every transaction, and the revenue never stopped flowing. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, Corinth had a population estimated at 90,000 people and a reputation that reached every harbor in the known world. The historian J.B. Salmon titled his authoritative study of the city simply "Wealthy Corinth," because no single word captured its identity more accurately. Corinthian artisans produced pottery and bronze work that commanded premium prices from Iberia to the Levant. Corinthian purple dye extracted from murex shells harvested in the Gulf competed with the famed Tyrian purple for the most expensive textile coloring. In the Mediterranean, Corinthian ship builders designed war GS that were copied across the Greek world, and at every level of this economy, women were present. The wives of Corinth's merchant families managed households that functioned as commercial operations. They supervised domestic slaves, managed inventories of trade goods stored in residential warehouses, tracked debts and payments, and in many documented cases negotiated directly with suppliers and ship captains when their husbands were away. These were not women confined to back rooms. Corinthian society, while still structured around male authority, gave its women more economic visibility than most Greek cities permitted. Wealth demanded it when a merchant household controlled inventory worth more than most families in other cities would see in a lifetime. The wife who managed that inventory held real power, even if the law did not formally acknowledge it. The wives of the political elite occupied a different but equally prominent position. They dedicated offerings at the cities' temples, sponsored public festivals, hosted diplomatic guests, and displayed their families' wealth through jewelry, clothing, and the number of personal attendants they brought to public events at the Isthmian Games held every 2 years outside Corinth and attended by athletes and spectators from across the Greek world. The wives of councilmen and generals sat in reserved seats, wearing gold that announced their status as clearly as any title, and above all of this, literally above the city, on the great rock of the Acorinth, stood the Temple of Aphrodite. The geographer Strauss, writing several generations after the destruction but drawing on earlier sources, recorded that the sanctuary had once possessed more than 1,000 sacred servants, women who had been dedicated to the goddess by wealthy donors as acts of piety. The Greek word he used was hiodulai, sacred slaves. Scholars continue to debate the exact nature of these women's service and whether the accounts of ritual companionship at the temple were historical fact or later exaggeration. What is not debated is that the temple was spectacularly wealthy, that the women within it were legally, thus, property of the sanctuary, that their labor generated significant revenue, and that the institution was so famous it produced a saying that echoed across the entire Greek-speaking world: not for every man is the voyage to Corinth. The proverb meant that the city's pleasures and opportunities were reserved for those who could afford them, think about what this means for the women who were about to lose everything. These were not women living anonymously in some obscure village on the margins of civilization. These were women whose city was known by name in every port from Massilia to Alexandria. Women who wore gold they had personally placed at the feet of Aphrodite's statue. Women whose husbands governed of allied city-states and sat at tables where the future of Greece was debated. Their identities were inseparable from the identity of the city. When Corinth fell, they did not merely lose their homes, they lost the entire framework of meaning that had defined their lives. There was another dimension to Corinthian women's lives that the ancient sources mention without fully explaining. Corinth maintained a sanctuary of Data and Corit on the northern slope of the Acro-Corinth, and this cult was managed entirely by women. The priestesses of Dia oversaw rituals connected to fertility, harvest, and the transition between life and death. Rituals that were among the oldest in the Greek world, and that excluded men entirely for the women who served them. These roles, religious authority was not metaphorical, they controlled sacred knowledge, managed temple funds, decided who could participate in ceremonies and who could not. They were within the boundaries of their sanctuary, the highest authorities present. The idea that women like these would be stripped of their names and sold as household property would have seemed to any Greek of the period like a violation of something deeper than human law. But Corinth was making decisions that would bring all of this crashing down, and the women had no vote, no voice, and no power to stop it. The Iron League, the federation of Greek city-states that Corinth helped lead, had been in escalating conflict with Rome for more than 2 decades. In 167, before the Common Era, after the Third Macedonian War, Rome had deported 1,000 prominent Arn citizens to Italy as hostages. Among them was the historian Polybius, the son of a former Achaean general. They were held for 17 years without trial and without formal charges. By the time the survivors were released in 150, many had died in exile, and those who returned came home with a fury that reshaped Greek politics. The generation that followed their return was done compromising with Rome. In the summer of 147, the Roman Senate sent a commission to Corinth led by Lucius Aurelius. Arrests. The commission delivered a demand that landed like a thunderbolt. Rome ordered the Iron League to expel Corinth, Argos, Heraclea, and Orchomos from its membership. This was not a diplomatic adjustment, this was the surgical dismemberment of the League, stripping it of its most powerful cities and reducing it to a helpless fragment. The crowd in the Corinthian assembly erupted. Spartans who had taken refuge with the Roman commissioners were dragged from their protection and attacked. The commissioners themselves were pelted with refuse. Orestes fled back to Rome and told the Senate that Roman lives had been endangered. The General Critaus spent the winter of 147 to 146 preparing for war. To fund the army, the League imposed emergency levies. Polybius, who recorded the period in detail, described what this meant for the women of the League cities. The men were forced to contribute whatever they were supposed to possess, and the women stripping themselves and their children of their jewelry had to contribute this to a fun that could only bring destruction. Upon them, gold earrings that had been wedding gifts, necklaces passed down. From mothers, brooches that marked her family's status at public events, or melted down to pay soldiers and buy weapons. The women donated their wealth. Knowing it would fund a war, they could not have known they were financing the army whose defeat would deliver them into slavery. The Roman writer Livy, whose detailed account of the period survives only in fragments and summaries by later authors, noted a detail that the Greek sources understandably omitted. Rome's mercantile class had been pushing the Senate to act against Corinth for years, not because of the diplomatic insults, but because Corinth was a commercial rival. Its position on the isthmus gave it control over trade routes that Roman merchants wanted to dominate. The historian Mommsen, writing in the 19th century, argued that the Senate's decision to destroy Corinth was driven as much by commercial jealousy as by any strategic or punitive logic. Women of Corinth were not just casualties of war, they were casualties of a trade dispute escalated to annihilation by an empire that had the military power to settle economic arguments permanently. Criers marched north in the spring of 146 and was destroyed when word reached Corinth that the army had been routed and its general killed. The assembly elected Duz to replace him, Dusas, already infamous for his political corruption and his willingness to imprison anyone who advocated for peace, immediately began drafting every man in the city capable of holding a weapon. He freed slaves and armed them. He confiscated private property to fund his military preparations, and the women of Corinth watched their household servants march away to become soldiers. Their stored grain requisitioned for the army, and their city transformed. In the spring of 146 before the Common Era, Rome sent Lucius Mummius to Greece with 23,000 infantry and 3,500 cavalry. Mummius was not a brilliant commander. He had served competently in Hispania, but he had no reputation for strategic innovation and no history of mercy toward defeated populations. What he had was something more dangerous than either talent. He had explicit instructions from the Roman Senate, and the Senate wanted Corinth to serve as a warning that would silence Greek resistance for a generation. The war itself was over almost before it started. Kretos, the armed general who had spent the winter building an army and rallying support across the league, was killed or took his own life at the Battle of Scheria in central Greece, routed by forces under Quintus Caecilius. Maitles before Mummus even arrived. Command fell to Daces of Megalopolis, who gathered what remained, 14,000 infantry, 650 cavalry. Some of these soldiers were experienced Akan fighters. Many were not. Polybius recorded that Daces had drafted freed slaves and armed citizens with minimal training, equipping them with whatever could be found. He positioned this army at the Isthmus of Corinth on the narrow strip of land between the two seas and waited for the Romans. The battle unfolded with the terrible predictability of a mismatch. The armed infantry, to their credit, held the initial Roman charge for a brief period. The two lines pushed against each other in the grinding close-quarters combat that ancient warfare demanded. But the armed cavalry, outnumbered nearly 6 to 1, did not even wait to receive the Roman charge, they saw the mass of Roman and allied horsemen bearing down on them, and they scattered. Once the flanks were exposed, Mummus sent 1,000 picked infantrymen into the gap. The line came apart. What followed was not a battle, it was a pursuit. Roman cavalry ran down fleeing men across the plain. Samarkand's made it back to the walls of Corinth. Most did not. Daces, the man who had started this war, who had bribed his way into power, arrested peace advocates, rejected every negotiation, and armed slaves to fight a war they could not win, did not stay to defend the city. He did not rally the survivors behind the walls. He did not try to negotiate a surrender that might have spared the civilian population. He mounted a horse and rode south. According to the Greek traveler Pausanias, who wrote about these events approximately 300 years later, drawing on earlier historical accounts, does arrived at his home city of Megalopolis and performed a sequence of actions that reveals more about what Roman victory meant for women than any battle account ever could. He killed his wife. Pausanias says he poisoned her. The French historians reference in the dictionary Universal mentions that he also killed his children. Then he burned his house and everything he owned. Then he swallowed poison himself. Consider what this calculation tells you. Daz was a general who had led armies, manipulated political assemblies, imprisoned his opponents, and provoked a war against the most powerful military force in the world. He was not a man who made emotional decisions. When he looked at the situation with total clarity, he concluded that death was better than what the Romans would do to his wife if she was captured. He was not guessing. He had seen what Rome did. Every Greek of his generation had. The sack of Epirus in 167 before the Common Era, just 21 years earlier, had resulted in 150,000 people being sold into slavery in a single operation. The name of that atrocity was still fresh. Daz knew exactly what was coming for the women of Corinth, and he chose to spare his own wife the only way he could. But there was no one to spare Thea, no one to spare her neighbor Daphne and her 3 children, no one to spare the thousands of women who remained inside the walls of a city whose army was shattered and whose general had run. The 3 days that followed the battle were in some ways worse than the sack itself. Mummus did not enter Corinth. Immediately, the gates were open. The surviving iron troops had fled or hidden, but the Roman consul suspected a trap. He had heard stories of ambushes inside conquered cities, and he was not going to risk his soldiers in narrow streets where an organized defense could inflict serious casualties. So he waited. He posted sentries at the gates, and he waited inside the city. The women knew what was coming. They had heard the battle. They had seen the survivors stumbling back through the gates, bleeding, broken, some carrying wounded men on their shoulders. They had watched the strongest and fastest of the surviving soldiers keep running straight through the city and out the southern gates, heading for the mountains, and then the soldiers stopped coming. The gates stood open, the streets went quiet, and on the plain beyond the walls, 23,000 Roman soldiers sat in their camp, visible from every high point in the city, and did nothing. For 3 days the women of Corinth existed. The space between catastrophe and its Consequences, they could not leave. Roads south were watched by Roman scouts and any group of people moving. On foot would be intercepted, they could not fight the men who might have organized a defense were dead, fled, or hiding in cellars hoping to be overlooked. They could not negotiate. There was no one authorized to speak for the city, no diplomatic channel, no intermediary willing to cross the open ground between the walls and the Roman camp. Some women tried to run anyway. Small groups slipped out through them southern gates in the pre-dawn darkness, heading for Argos or the mountain villages of Arcadia, those with jewelry sewn into the hems of their clothing, or coins hidden in their hair might have enough to buy passage on a boat from one of the fishing villages along the coast. Those without money had nothing but their feet and whatever food they could carry. How many made it? No source. Records, how many were caught by Roman patrols or by bandits who preyed on refugees fleeing destroyed cities? No source. Records that either the women who succeeded in escaping simply vanished from the historical record, which means they survived, but it also means we will never know their stories. The women who stayed in the city organized what they could in the absence of male authority, the informal networks that Corinthian women had maintained for generations, networks built around temples, market relationships, family connections, and neighborhood bonds, became the only functioning social structure in the city. Women shared food with neighbors who had none. Women with medical knowledge tended the wounded. Soldiers who had dragged themselves back through the gates, women with young children gathered in groups because there was safety, or at least the illusion of safety, in numbers. These were not heroic actions in the way that ancient sources typically celebrate. No poet would commemorate them. No historian would record them, but they were acts of organization and mutual care performed under conditions that would have shattered most people's capacity to function. Among the women trapped inside Corinth during those 3 days was a population that the ancient sources mention only in passing, but whose fate was particularly devastating. The women who had served in the temples of the city, Corinth, maintained sanctuaries dedicated to Aphrodite, Apollo, Athene, Poseidon, Dia, Isis, and Eslios, among others. Each sanctuary employed women in roles ranging from senior priestesses who oversaw rituals and managed temple finances to servants who cleaned the sacred spaces, maintained the sacrificial fires, and served food at festival banquets. The temple of Aphrodite on the Acra. Corinth alone had in its most prosperous period housed over 1,000 women. By 146, the number was certainly smaller, reduced by the economic disruptions of the wars and by the levies imposed to fund the Iron Army. But a woman named Dis would have been among those who remained. She was 26 years old. She had been dedicated to the temple as a girl by her father, a merchant from Sicyon, who had given her as a votive offering to the goddess after surviving a shipwreck in the Corinthian Gulf. She had spent 14 years on the Acro. Corinth. She could play the cithara, recite the Homeric hymns from memory, and perform the rituals of offering and purification that the Corinthians believed maintained the goddess's favor toward their city. She was, in the language of the time, a hieros, a sacred servant in the language of the Roman army that was about to enter the city. She was inventory, Mertes was inner. Position that would have been recognizable to anyone who understood the machinery of ancient slavery. She was already in a legal sense property. She belonged to the temple. She had been given as a dedication, and her service, whatever form it took, generated revenue. For the sanctuary, she was not a free woman. She had no family network to protect her, no husband to negotiate on her behalf, no political connections to leverage, but within the temple she had something that the Roman slave markets would strip away completely. She had community. She lived among women she had known for years, women who shared her rituals, her music, her daily rhythms. She ate with them, she sang with them. She maintained the sacred fires alongside them through long nights when the wind came off the Gulf and the flames needed constant attention. The destruction of Corinth would not just change her legal status, which was already that of a bound servant. It would shatter the only community she had ever known and scatter its members across a continent. When the Romans came, these women would simply change owners. The sanctuary of Aphrodite would become Roman plunder, and its servants would become Roman slaves. The transition on paper would be almost seamless, one set of masters replaced by another, but there was a difference, and it was not a small one. In the temple, Mertes had status. She served a goddess who was the patron and protector of the entire city. She participated in rituals that the Corinthians believed kept their civilization safe when the Persians had threatened Greece 3 centuries earlier. It was women like Mdis who had gathered at the summit and prayed for deliverance, and the poet Simonides had honored their devotion in verse that was carved in stone in the Roman slave markets. None of this would matter. She would be merchandise with a price. She would wear a wooden placard around her neck listing her place of origin, her skills, and her physical condition. She would stand on a raised platform while men assessed her value, and then she would disappear into the Roman world, separated from every woman she had ever known, every ritual she had ever performed, and every stone of the only home she could remember. This is the detail that changes everything about what follows. The destruction of Corinth was not a single catastrophic event. It was a process, a systematic dismantling of an entire society carried out over days and weeks with the administrative precision that made Rome the most effective imperial power the world had ever seen, and it had been done before. The women of Corinth were not the first Greek women to face this machinery. 21 years earlier, the Roman general Aemilius Pace had coordinated the simultaneous sack of 70 cities in Epirus in a single day. The operation was timed so precisely that every city was struck at the same hour, preventing any from warning the others. 150,000 Epirotes were enslaved in that single coordinated action. The women and children of Epirus were marched to the coast, loaded onto ships, and sold at markets across the Mediterranean. The scale of the operation was so enormous that it depressed slave prices across the Roman world for years. Corinthian merchants, ironically, had been among the buyers. Corinthian households had purchased Epirote slaves at discount prices, the very same prices driven down by the sheer volume of human beings that Rome's military had dumped. Onto the market, now the women of Corinth were about to enter the same system, the same sorting procedures, the same chain marches to the coast, the same auctions under the spear, the same wooden placards listing their names, their skills and their estimated value. The machinery that had processed the women of Epirus would process the women of Corinth with the same indifference, because the system did not distinguish between peoples, it distinguished only between categories of product. There is one more thing that needs to be understood about what happened inside Corinth during those 3 days, because it reveals something about the women who were trapped there that the ancient sources written by men uniformly failed to appreciate. When the Iron Army collapsed and the male leadership fled or died, the social order of the city should have disintegrated completely. And in some ways it did. The looting on the first night was evidence of that. But the women did not descend into chaos. They organized, they shared resources, they cared for the wounded and the children. They made decisions hour by hour about how to survive in a city abandoned by its generals, its politicians and its soldiers. The women were the last functioning community. Rome was about to destroy it. Now let me return to that window where Thea stood on the third morning, because the waiting was about to end. Mummers entered Corinth in full force on the third day. Every soldier armed, formation tight. He still feared a trap. What he found instead was a city that was mostly empty. The surviving iron soldiers had scattered. Most Corinthians who could run had already run, fleeing south toward Argos or east toward the coast. But thousands remained, the elderly who could not travel, the sick and the wounded, mothers with infants who could not carry children, and supplies over mountain roads with no protection, and women like Thea, whose husband was dead or missing, whose household had been looted, whose neighbors had fled, and who had 2 daughters she could not abandon and nowhere safe to take them. Panagonas described what happened next in a single sentence that compresses an atrocity into grammar. Most of those that were left in the city were slain by the Romans, and the women and children were sold by Mummius, as also were the slaves who had been given their freedom and had fought on the side of the AANS and had not been killed in action. What Pausanias packed into that sentence unfolded over days. The Roman army did not storm through the city in a chaotic frenzy of killing and plunder. There was a system. By 146, Roman military protocol for the sack of a resisting city was a well-established procedure, honed over generations of conquest. Quaestor, the officer responsible for the army's finances, took charge of the human captives. Soldiers separated the population into categories. Men of military age were killed. This was standard practice for a city that had defied Rome. Women, children, the elderly and formerly enslaved people who had survived the fighting were gathered, counted, and held under guard in open areas, likely the agora or the athletic grounds near the city center. Thea would have been pulled from her house with her daughters by soldiers who spoke no Greek or who did not care to use it. Roman legionaries clearing a conquered city worked methodically, street by street, house by house. Doors that were closed were broken open, rooms were searched, valuables were seized and carried to collection points. people found hiding were dragged into the streets and added to the growing crowds of captives being herded toward the city center. The process was efficient because it had been practiced many times. The Roman army had sacked cities in Iberia, in Africa, and Macedonia. Epirus, the soldiers knew what they were doing. Some of them had done it before. If Thea's husband's identity was known, and in a city of this size, where political families were publicly visible, their houses marked by their quality and location, it almost certainly was she would have been flagged as a woman of value, the wife of a councilman, educated, literate Greek, experienced in managing a complex household with multiple slaves, significant trade inventory, and social obligations that required knowledge of protocol, music, and conversation. In the accounting of the Roman slave economy, every one of these qualities increased her price. She was not an anonymous captive, she was a premium product. The separation of mothers from children was not always immediate, but it was systematic. Young children who could not survive independently were kept with their mothers because a mother and infant together were a single unit of sale. Older children, those above approximately 7 years of age, could be sold separately, and the market preferred to sell them separately because individual sales generated higher total revenue than group lots. Thea's daughters at 12 and 9 fell into this category, whether they were separated from her at Corinth at the initial auction or at a secondary market. The result was the same. The family unit that had existed in the house on the hill above the agora ceased to exist as a legal or practical reality. The moment the Roman soldiers came through the door, her daughters would have been assessed on different terms. The 12-year-old was approaching the age where she could be trained for skilled domestic service, or within a few years sold at the elevated prices that the market assigned to young women from cultured backgrounds. The 9-year-old was young enough to be shaped into almost any role an owner required. Roman slave owners thought in terms of investment and return. A Greek girl from a wealthy family purchased young and trained over several years could be sold at significant profit or retained as a valuable household asset for decades. The system was patient. It treated human beings with the same calculating patience that a farmer applied to an orchard plant now, harvest later. Polybius, the art historian who had spent 16 years as a Roman hostage and who understood both civilizations more intimately than perhaps any person alive, returned from Africa to witness the aftermath. He had stood beside the Roman general Scipio Elanes just weeks earlier and watched Carthage burn. Now, he walked through the wreckage of one of his own people's greatest cities. He recorded a scene that has survived in fragments passed down through later writers. Roman soldiers had thrown priceless paintings on the ground and were using them as surfaces for dice games. Among them was a painting of Dionysus by the celebrated artist Aristides, a work so famous that it had generated a proverb known across the Greek world. The soldiers did not know what it was. They did not care. Polybius also noted that Mummus, when arranging for the transport of looted artwork to Italy, warned the shipping contractors that if any pieces were lost or damaged, the Contractors would have to replace them with new ones of equal value. Statement that revealed the consul had no understanding whatsoever of what he was destroying, but the artwork was the layer of destruction that history chose to remember, because artwork could be described and mourned, and in some cases eventually recovered. The jockey of Artemis, a stunning bronze sculpture of a young boy riding a galloping horse, may have been looted from Corinth during the sack and was recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Euba 2,000 years later. It sits in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens today, one of the few physical objects that might have been touched by the hands of Corinthian women. Before the city fell, the human layer of the destruction was different in kind. The tens of thousands of women and children being processed through Rome's enslavement machinery left almost no trace in the surviving record, no letters smuggled from slave quarters, no inscriptions carved by captive hands, no memorials erected by sympathetic observers. They were counted, not named, priced, not mourned, dispersed so thoroughly across the Mediterranean world that no two members of the same Corinthian family may have ever seen each other again, and then they were moved within days of the sack. The women of Corinth began the journey that would erase them from history. The Roman military questa organized the first slave auction at the site of the armies camped near the ruined city. These initial sales, called vendio sub hasta, sales under the spear, because a spear was planted upright in the ground to mark the auction site, were wholesale transactions. Professional slave traders who followed the Roman legions as a regular part of their business operations purchased captives in bulk lots sorted roughly by age, physical condition, and apparent value. The traders paid the military. The military forwarded the proceeds to the Roman treasury, and the Republic's war machine funded itself from the bodies of the people it conquered. This was not an aberration, it was the economic model. Rome ran its wars at a profit, and the sale of human beings from conquered cities was one of the primary revenue streams. The first sorting was brutal in its efficiency. Women were separated from their children if the children were old enough to be sold independently. Mothers holding infants might be kept together because an infant increased or decreased the mother's price depending on the buyer's needs. Elderly women and those with visible injuries or illnesses were grouped into lower value lots and sold cheaply, often to owners of agricultural estates where physical labor was the only requirement and life expectancy was short. The women of higher perceived value, the wives of officials, the educated, the young, the physically attractive according to the aesthetic standards of Roman buyers, were held separately. They would not be sold in bulk, they would be transporting to larger markets where individual buyers could inspect them and where competition between bidders would drive prices higher. This is where the market's treatment of Corinthian noble women diverged most sharply from what happened to the common women of the city. A wife of a fisherman or a dock worker, a woman whose skills were limited to the domestic tasks of a modest household, would be sold in a group lot to an agricultural estate. Southern Italy or Sicily, she would spend the rest of her life working fields, pressing olives, or processing wool alongside dozens of other enslaved women from a dozen different conquered territories, the working conditions on these estates were documented by Roman agricultural writers like Cato and Camilla, who discussed the management of enslaved laborers with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to discuss the management of livestock, feed them enough to maintain productivity, house them in quarters that prevent escape but allow reproduction because children born to enslaved mothers were a free source of additional labor, work them until they could no longer produce, then sell them at reduced prices or simply let them age out on the cheapest possible maintenance. A Corinthian woman who had once bought fish at the harbor and spun wool in a courtyard where her children played would within months of the sack be performing the same tasks under Roman supervision in a foreign country, surrounded by people whose languages she did not speak for the remainder of her life. Her identity as a Corinthian would fade within months. Her name would be replaced by whatever her owner chose to call her. If she survived the first years of adjustment, she might live to old age, invisible to history, buried without a marker in a corner of the estate where the soil was too poor for planting. But a woman like Thea, a woman who could manage accounts, converse intelligently with guests, oversee complex household operations, and read and write Greek, was worth far more than a field laborer, and the market knew it precisely. Educated Greek slaves were among the most expensive and most sought after commodities in the Roman world. Roman aristocratic families were in the middle of a cultural transformation that the poet Horace would later summarize in a line that became one of the most famous in Latin literature: conquered Greece took captive her savage conqueror. Roman elites wanted Greek tutors for their children, Greek musicians for their banquets, Greek secretaries for their correspondence in Greek household, managers who understood the sophisticated domestic culture that Roman society was eager to absorb. Corinthian noble woman was from this perspective a perfect acquisition. She embodied the culture that Rome simultaneously destroyed and coveted. She would have been transporting by ship, likely to the island of Delos, which had become the largest slave trading hub in the Mediterranean. The Romans had declared Delos a free port 20 years earlier, eliminating customs, taxes, and creating an environment where massive volumes of human cargo could be processed with minimal overhead. The geographer Strauss recorded that the market at Delos could handle the sale of 10,000 human beings in a single day. The women of Corinth arrived into this machinery alongside captives from territories across the Roman world. Their identity as citizens of one of the most famous cities in Greece already dissolving into the undifferentiated mass of Roman merchandise at the secondary markets. The degradation became personal. Each captive wore a wooden placard, a titulus hung around the neck on a cord. The placard listed the person's place of origin, their skills, their physical attributes, and any known defects, both physical and mental. Buyers inspected captives the way they would inspect any commodity they were considering purchasing. Feet examined for damage from long marches, which indicated a captive transporting from distant territories. Hands examined for calluses, indicating a history of manual labor. Teeth checked for age and condition. Eyes checked for disease for women. Additional assessments were conducted that the surviving sources describe only in indirect terms because the Roman writers who recorded the process saw nothing remarkable about it. It was commerce, it was how the world worked. The market at Delos was arranged to maximize throughput. The Italian merchants who operated there had built facilities specifically for processing large numbers of human beings. There were holding areas where new arrivals were kept before sale, fed minimally, and cleaned so they would present well to buyers. There were raised platforms where individual captives could be displayed. There were covered areas where wealthy buyers could inspect premium merchandise away from the general crowds. The architecture of Delos, some of which survives and has been excavated by archaeologists, tells the story of a place designed with the same rational efficiency that the Romans applied to every other commercial enterprise: warehouses for grain, warehouses for wine, warehouses for people. A Corinthian noble woman who had once hosted diplomats and poets in a house overlooking the Agora now stood on one of those platforms while Roman businessmen calculated her worth in sources. Her education was an asset. Her familiarity with household management was an asset. Her knowledge of music and social protocol was an asset. Her ability to speak cultured Greek in a society that increasingly valued Greek culture as a mark of sophistication was an asset. The very qualities that had defined her status in Corinth were now line items on a slave trader's inventory, each one adding to a price that would be paid by a stranger who would own her completely. For the temple women, the transition carried a particular cruelty. A woman like Myrtis, who had spent her entire adult life serving Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth, might be purchased by a Roman household that maintained a private shrine. She might find herself performing rituals she had once performed freely, tending an altar to Venus in a villa outside Rome, arranging offerings, cleaning sacred objects, reciting prayers. The motions would be the same, the music would be the same, the incense would smell the same, but she would be doing it as property owned by people who had destroyed the city where the goddess had been worshipped for 7 centuries. The continuity of practice combined with the complete annihilation of autonomy created a form of psychological destruction that had no name in the ancient world. Modern clinicians would recognize it as a sustained dissociative response, the mind's way of surviving a reality that cannot be processed or accepted. For the children, the system operated with particular patience and particular brutality. Roman slave law was clear. Children born to enslaved mothers were themselves enslaved from birth, regardless of who the father was. They as daughters, the 12-year-old and the 9-year-old, if they survived the sorting, the voyage and the sale, would grow up as slaves. They would be given new Roman names by their owners, a deliberate severing of the identity their parents had chosen for them. If they proved intelligent and compliant, they might be educated for skilled domestic roles which offered better material conditions but no more freedom. If they were assigned to agricultural labor, their lives would be shorter and harder. If they bore children of their own, those children would be slaves within a single generation. The granddaughter of a Corinthian councilman would be legally indistinguishable from the granddaughter of any other enslaved person anywhere. The Roman world, after Mummus completed the sack, a commission of 10 senators arrived from Rome to impose a final settlement. They dissolved the League entirely, ending the last significant political organization of independent Greek states. They placed all of Greece under the supervision of the Roman governor in Macedonia. They declared Corinth's territory publicus, public land of the Roman state, meaning any Roman citizen could purchase and exploit it. They awarded the neighboring city of Sicyon control of the Isthmian Games, stripping Corinth of its most prestigious cultural institution. And then they ordered the physical destruction of what remained of the city. The walls were pulled down, buildings were demolished or burned. Corinth was to be not just conquered, but erased. The city lay uninhabited for 102 years, the harbor at Limes silted over, the breakwaters crumbling without maintenance, the dockos cracked and buckled under winter rains with no one to repair the stone. Weeds grew through the marble paving of the agora, where merchants had once shouted prices in 12 languages. The 7 monolithic Doric columns of the Temple of Apollo, which had stood since the 6th century before the Common Era, remained upright in this emptiness, marking a city that no longer existed. On the summit of the Corinth, the temple of Aphrodite lay abandoned, its sacred vessels looted, its servants gone, its altars cold. Wild grass grew between the flagstones where women had once knelt in prayer. Scattered across the Roman world, the women of Corinth lived out the rest of their lives in silence. Roman law allowed for manumission, the formal freeing of slaves by their owners, and it is possible that some Corinthian women were eventually freed, particularly those who served in domestic roles where a bond of familiarity might develop over years. Freed slave, a libertina, could own property, conduct business, and live independently, but she could never hold public office, and she carried the legal mark of her former status for life. Her children, if born after manumission, would be free citizens. Her children born during enslavement would remain slaves unless separately freed. The bureaucratic distinction between a free woman and a formerly enslaved woman followed her to the grave, and even for those who gained their freedom, Corinth was gone. There was nothing to return to. The city was rubble and weeds for a century. The community that had given their lives meaning had been atomized and scattered beyond any possibility of reassembly. Cicero, writing a century after the destruction, captured what the twin catastrophes of 146 meant for the Mediterranean world in a phrase that has survived. The 2 eyes of the sea coast were extinguished. Carthage in the west, Corinth in the east, both destroyed in the same year. Both their populations killed or enslaved, both their lands confiscated. It was not coincidence, it was a statement of imperial intent so comprehensive that it required no further explanation. The age of independent power centers in the Mediterranean was over in 44 before the Common Era. Julius Caesar refounded Corinth as a Roman colony, Colonia Laos, Iulia Corinthiensis. The new inhabitants were not Greeks. They were Roman freed men and military veterans, people who had been slaves themselves or who had spent decades in the legions. They built Roman structures Over Greek foundations, they worshipped Venus where Aphrodite had been honored. They spoke Latin in streets where Greek had been spoken for 1,000 years. The Acro-Corinth was refortified. The harbors were rebuilt, trade resumed. By the time the Apostle Paul arrived a century later to establish a Christian community, Corinth was prosperous again. But it was a Roman city wearing a Greek's name like an inherited garment that no longer fit. You can walk through the ruins of Corinth today. The 7 columns of Apollo's temple still stand. The Acro-Corinth still rises above the plain, 550 m of limestone crowned by walls that were built and rebuilt by Romans, Byzantines, Franks, Venetians, and Ottomans. The spring of Pern where the Corinthians believe the winged horse Pegasus once drank still flows from the rock face at the base of the hill. Archaeologists have found layers of ash and collapsed walls dating precisely to 146, physical proof of the burning that the ancient sources describe, but no inscription, no letter, no memorial of any kind preserves the name of a single woman who was enslaved in that destruction. Polybius, the man who watched Carthage and Corinth burn in the same year, recorded a moment at the fall of Carthage that has echoed across 22 centuries. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianes, standing amid the flames, grasped Polybius by the hand and said, "A glorious moment, Polybius, but I have a dread foreboding that someday the same doom will be pronounced on my own country." Even the man who ordered the destruction understood that what he was building was temporary, that the capacity to annihilate another civilization does not protect your own from annihilation. Was does a coward for killing his wife and fleeing, or was the poison he gave her the last act of protection available to a man who had failed at everything else? If you had been a Corinthian woman on that third morning watching 23,000 soldiers form up on the plain, would you have tried to run with your children, or would you have stayed and hoped for terms that were never offered? And how do you judge a civilization that debated the destruction of Corinth the way it debated road construction as a matter of administrative policy, of commercial competition, of what message needed to be sent and to whom? If this stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who should hear it. The women of Corinth did not have names in the Roman ledgers. They had prices, they had places of origin listed on wooden placards hung around their necks. They had skills catalogued and defects noted for the benefit of buyers who would never know and never care what they had once been, but every one of them had a name once in a city between two seas before the legions.